Now, I see this happen all the time. I've even had it happen to me more times than I can count. You'll be discussing Star Wars with someone, or I'll say something in a video, and you'll point out what could be deemed as a flaw or a mistake with one of the movies or stories. Something that, even in universe, doesn't make a whole lot of sense, or maybe flies in the face of something that's been previously established elsewhere. And the other person will simply say, Star Wars is for kids, as if that immediately ends the discussion or debate and wins it for them. And one of the things I find so irritating about this argument, beyond just how short-sighted they're being, is how insulting it is to, well, everyone. It's insulting to kids because it implies it's perfectly acceptable that standards be lower for them, or that they won't be able to figure out what is or isn't good storytelling. So why worry about making sense when it can just be flashy and look cool, right? I mean, this argument is basically saying that since they're young, they're only concerned with surface level things and couldn't possibly grasp and enjoy something complex. This argument is also insulting to adult Star Wars fans, and the irony is it's often made by adult Star Wars fans. Because more often than not, when the words Star Wars is for kids gets uttered, it's done in an attempt to put someone down for caring too much about it, or looking too deeply at something they shouldn't, something that should only be for kids and isn't meant for adults to analyze. That they should grow up and move on and worry about other, more adult things. Though I'd argue that as long as someone handles their personal responsibilities in life, what they do with their free time isn't for me or anyone else to judge or be concerned about. Assuming, of course, what they're doing isn't harming others. And being a huge fan of Star Wars who likes to discuss it or debate it all the time isn't harming anyone, even if they're bringing up things wrong with the franchise. And not to get too far off topic here, but to those who like to label some fans as toxic, you do realize the only thing you're actually accomplishing is letting them know that what they're saying is bothering you. That when you name or label something, you give it legitimacy, you give it power. I know you're trying to put them down and belittle them in an effort to silence them or make them reflect on how they're in the wrong, but what you're actually doing is emboldening them. When you name, call, or act dismissive towards someone for their beliefs, what you're doing is encouraging them to get louder and more aggressive in an effort to defend themselves, their views, or those beliefs. And yes, it is very much a two-way street. I'm not here to defend people who get truly angry and hateful, but all that's really going on here is an endless, very tiring loop, where one side attacks the other, and the other side then retaliates, and it goes back and forth with each side getting angrier and nastier, or feeding each other more and more, and just keeping the wheel turning. A good recent example of how this works, and I'm not saying it was necessarily his intent, was the little rant Freddie Prinze Jr. went on last week, where he said that older fans are just angry because the franchise isn't for them anymore, that it's not aging with them. And he summed up his little rant by saying those infamous words that Star Wars is for frickin' kids, though he didn't say frickin'. And there were fans on the pro-Disney side who applauded him for this, who said he had shut down the haters and hit him with a truth bomb, apparently not realizing that he was insulting them too because they're adult fans who love Star Wars and who apparently take it very seriously if they're worried about it being criticized by other fans. Instead, they were too concerned about trying to claim some sort of victory because a guy who is supposedly in the know went on a profanity-laced rant where he was actually wrong about a lot of things in regards to how the Force works. But I digress, because I'm getting even more off track here, and I talked about this all in another video. But in that video, I tried to point out that even a fan who has been almost directly educated by the creator himself, because Freddie Prinze Jr. worked with Dave Filoni, who worked with George Lucas for years, can get things wrong. So maybe these aren't exactly always the simplest themes. That maybe there are messages within Star Wars that are easily missed or misunderstood, and that there is something for people of all ages to take away and possibly learn from if they do want to dig deeply and discuss it as adults. That you can't in one breath say that these movies are no more than simple fairy tales created for children, and in the next breath say that most people can't understand them or are getting them wrong. And this happens all the time with The Last Jedi. If you point out things that don't make sense about that film, some people will say it's for children and you're looking too closely at it when it's not meant for that kind of examination. Yet oftentimes those very same people, when they defend the movie, will give very long-winded explanations about why it's brilliant. They'll imply there's a subtlety to it that's easily overlooked or missed if you don't pay close enough attention and don't look beyond that outer shell. Which leads me to ask, is Star Wars for kids, and dumb ones at that, who easily miss and overlook simple flaws, or is it for intellectuals who can grasp what the common folk clearly cannot? But seriously here, a very common response to the Star Wars is for kids argument is to instead say it's for everyone. Which, yes, sounds great, and it's a statement that I can almost wholeheartedly agree with. However, I'd actually say that Star Wars is, or should in some ways strive to be, for nearly anybody, but that it's not for everybody. And before you run to the comments to disagree with me or to call me names, please just hear me out. What I'm saying is not as bad as that may have just sounded. Basically, and I know I'm saying the obvious here, but you can't make something that will appeal to absolutely everybody, especially something so subjective in nature as a movie. In fact, the more you try to please everyone, the more likely you are to satisfy no one. And an argument can be made that you're better off making something very specific and making almost all fans of that thing happy than you are casting your net wide and trying to appeal to as many people as you can, but no one specifically. And because I do love my analogies, and I worked in the restaurant industry for years, maybe a good way to explain all this is to talk about how there seems to be two schools of thought or two different types of restaurants, more or less. First, you have your restaurants which have a very small, focused, and themed menu, where they're trying to do just a few things really, really well, and hence draw customers because they're the best at what they do. For example, you'll have one restaurant that makes the best pizza in town, but that's pretty much all they do and focus on. Or you'll have one that makes the best, most authentic Mexican food around, but again, that's pretty much all they do. And both will do extremely good business because they focus on being great at one thing, and customers go there because they know they do that one thing very well. Others will then hear that they're the best at this thing, or this type of food, and will then, assuming they want that type of food, be intrigued enough to go check them out. On the other hand, though, you'll have restaurants with huge menus that try to offer a little bit of everything or appeal to everyone. They'll cast that net really wide. And don't get me wrong, they have their place and can certainly be very successful, especially when groups of people can't decide on what type of food they want, or they want different things, so they pick a place with variety. Problem is, usually places like that don't do anything great, and everything they offer, at best, is good to average. And in the end, some of the customers walk away unsatisfied. Well, maybe others enjoyed what they ordered, but it wasn't as good as that place across town that specializes in it. And so they're not coming back or telling anyone else to go there. In other words, there's a reason why most restaurants have a theme or serve only one type of food. Or if they offer a huge variety, they tend to be on the cheaper side to attract people that way. And by that same token, Star Wars is best when it just tries to be Star Wars. No more, no less. One of the reasons why the first Star Wars movie and trilogy was so great, and why so many people fell in love with it, isn't because it tried to be something that appealed to absolutely everyone. It's because George Lucas and company knew what they wanted it to be, embraced that, and did it extremely well. What was originally designed to be, yes, a movie aimed primarily at 12-year-old boys, and Lucas himself has said that, ended up being so well made and enjoyable that many, many other people could also find enjoyment in it. And yeah, I know some of you will now say, aha, Thor, you just admitted Star Wars is for kids, case closed. But here's the thing. With the original trilogy, Lucas didn't operate under the assumption that children were mindless, fragile little China dolls that only wanted surface-level frills and couldn't handle more adult themes and imagery. Just look at the burning corpses of Uncle Owen and Aunt Beru, for example. Instead, Lucas actually gave kids a lot of credit because he himself remembered being that age and how much he got into and understood stories. And if the whole Star Wars is for kids argument does anything, it shows how much we coddle our kids today, or how little we think of them on the whole, compared to just 40 years ago. And though I'm all for protecting children against the real dangers of the world, there is a difference between that and sheltering them or not preparing them for the harsh realities of the world they will eventually face. Anyway, when Lucas said Star Wars is for kids or 12-year-old boys, what he was really saying is it was for those on the verge of adulthood, not toddlers still trying to learn their colors or their ABCs. He wasn't saying it was for young kids, not that they too couldn't or didn't enjoy it on some level. He was saying it was for older kids who were ready for the lessons to be had in the movie, lessons that could and obviously did resonate with those much older as well, those who could directly relate with the struggles of these very real characters, which is the real key to the success of Star Wars, I feel. The very real and grounded characters it gave us. So saying Star Wars is for kids in a dismissive way is also insulting to what it was originally meant to be, and it always saddens and stuns me a bit when fellow fans use it as some type of argument against Star Wars or other adult fans who take it very seriously, because you're completely missing the point of what the movies were supposed to be, which is not mindless entertainment for the very young. And yes, I will concede that at first glance at least, the prequels, and especially The Phantom Menace thanks to Jar Jar Binks, does seem to be for younger children. But if he's removed from that movie, or even just toned down a little bit, you'll end up with a story or trilogy that overall has plenty of adult themes and imagery. It's hard to convince me that Star Wars is for young kids when there's a scene in one of the movies where it's heavily implied and later confirmed that a room full of children is slaughtered by the former hero of the story, or when one of the complaints about the prequels is that there was way too much politics in the films, because we all know kids' movies usually focus on politics, right? Instead, the prequels were a trilogy that tried to be Star Wars, and you could take them or leave them as you will as far as George Lucas was concerned. They tried to tell a very specific story that, again, could and did resonate with many people of all ages. No, they certainly weren't perfect films, the dialogue could use some fixing, among other things, but I find very little flaw with the story itself. Rather, the problem was with the execution of that story, but that's a discussion for another time. Finally here, there's another way entirely to look at this debate about who Star Wars is for today, and that's to ask ourselves, does Disney and Lucasfilm think Star Wars is just for kids? Now, I could point at a movie like Rogue One, where one of the protagonists, that being Cassian Andor, shoots someone in the back very early in the film, and he's a character that will even be explored further in his own Disney Plus series. Or I could even point to another upcoming show on Disney Plus, The Mandalorian, and ask if you think that's going to be for kids. That said, let's just look at this entirely from the business perspective. Do you really think they, Disney and Lucasfilm, would take something that has amassed fans over the last 40 years and say, let's make it just for children, ignoring the older fans, some of which have long established careers, which means they have plenty of disposable income to spend on such things as expensive Star Wars merchandise, and there's plenty of that out there that I'm sure kids aren't buying or that parents aren't buying for their kids. Not to mention those older fans who do have kids of their own and can all but drag the younger generation into the franchise. Do you really think a company would ignore all those people? Not a chance. If anything, Star Wars today has become the exact opposite of being just for kids. They're doing everything they can to make Star Wars appeal to as many people as possible. They're becoming that restaurant that wants to offer something to everyone instead of just doing that one thing extremely well, which is make Star Wars movies. But again, the beauty of Star Wars originally is that it appealed to damn near anyone anyway, but it wasn't made for everyone. They weren't trying to lure in every type of person on the planet. Instead, it was that restaurant that just had perfected that one dish, and even though maybe sci-fi and or fantasy wasn't someone's thing, they still found something to love about Star Wars and enjoyed it. And no, this isn't an argument against diversity in Star Wars or anything like that. Though, if we're being honest here, I don't know how much a company like Disney truly cares about diversity and how much they care about expanding their customer base under the guise of diversity, which is win-win when you really think about it. Because not only do they look good, like they're a caring company, but they're making more money because the number of customers is increasing. And yeah, I know many people think they have an agenda at Disney, but I'd say that agenda, to what extent it exists, comes more from Lucasfilm than Disney. I think a vast majority of the shareholders at the end of the Pretty Little Disney Rainbow, you know, the ones who really own Star Wars, well, I think they care more about money than anything else. And they've likely been led to believe that diversity expands the customer base and leads to larger profit. But anyway, before I get even more off topic again, don't for 1 minute kid yourself into thinking that Disney thinks of Star Wars as a brand or product just for kids. Yes, they want to sell it to kids, of course, but they also want to sell it to anyone and everyone else under the sun with an extra dollar to spend, which is kind of the problem and what I've been trying to say here all along. They're trying to make it have mass appeal instead of creating a superior product that ends up with mass appeal. And no, the problem isn't the main character in the new trilogy being a girl. That'd be utterly irrelevant if the movies were fantastic. Instead, to be blunt about it, a lot of people feel like these new characters are just safe, bland, and boring, and that the story itself feels like a cheap imitation of the original ideas George Lucas had a long, long time ago. All because, again, they want everyone to just love these movies. It's not about actually just making good movies. And every time I hear someone say Star Wars is for kids, I feel like they're just trying to defend a franchise that is currently underperforming. One that once appealed to so many people just because of how great the movies they made actually were. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Apologies if this wasn't my most coherent video, or if I went off on a few tangents, but I'm just tired of people saying Star Wars is for kids as if that's some type of excuse. Anyway, by all means, let me know what you think of what I had to say here. If you agree or disagree with me, or whatever the case may be, leave a comment below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.